There are figures who step out of history, wrapped in the glow of victory, reform, and pages written in blood and brilliance. And then there is Catherine the Great, one of the most powerful queens the world has ever known. A woman who took Russia, awkward and unwieldy, and forged it into a great power standing shoulder to shoulder with the nations of civilized Europe. She corresponded with Voltaire, patronized Diderot, and personally expanded Russia's borders into Crimea, into lands that had once existed only in the dreams of czars. And yet, when her name is spoken, what do most people remember? Not the reforms, not the victories, not the new laws or the campaigns that reshaped empires. What lingers are the whispers, the rumors, the mocking laughter about her private life, tales of lovers, gossip about insatiable desires, and the most humiliating legend of them all, that she died while coupling with a horse. Yes, one of the sharpest minds of the 18th century, one of Russia's most successful rulers, is reduced in popular memory to a grotesque joke about lust. But why? Why is it so easy to cast aside the achievements of her reign in favor of bedroom stories? Was it simply because Catherine was a woman, and history has always been quick to remember female rulers by their bodies rather than their minds? Or was it because her power grew so immense that Europe trembled and slander became the cheapest weapon to cut down an empress? The story of Catherine the Great is the story of power and scandal, of triumph and humiliation, of a woman turned into a symbol of contradiction. And on this journey, we will search for an answer. Who was Catherine, truly? A queen of light, or a figure twisted and reshaped by the pens of those who sought to use her for their own ends? Catherine's story did not begin with a crown, but with a tiny, almost forgotten principality lost among the fractured lands of Germany. In 1729, a girl named Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst was born into a middling noble family, not rich, not powerful, scarcely known beyond their modest borders. Zerbst was a name that hardly anyone in Europe's high circles would have recognized, a place so small you might squint to find it on a map. And yet, from this obscurity, one of the towering figures of the century would emerge. Sophie grew up in a harsh but ambitious household. Her parents had little real power, but they possessed a hallmark of the lesser German nobility, an unrelenting hunger to marry well and rise in status. To them, children were not just children, but pawns on the chessboard of European dynastic alliances. Sophie, bright, determined, and endlessly curious, was quickly seen as one of their most promising pieces. That opportunity came when the Russian court, in its search for a suitable German bride, turned its gaze toward her. At the time, Russia looked westward with a mix of envy and longing. Peter the Great had tried to drag his empire out of medieval shadows into European modernity, and his heirs carried on the project through strategic marriages. The chosen heir to the throne was Peter III, grandson of Peter the Great. But Peter, alas, was an odd figure. He adored Germany more than Russia, preferred toy soldiers over governing, and loved his beer more than his crown. Sophie was chosen to be his bride, and at the age of 14, she left her small German homeland for the cold, unfamiliar, intrigue-filled world of the Russian court. Imagine her, a slender girl, not yet 16, stepping into the vast palaces of St. Petersburg, confronted with a foolish, inattentive fiancé and a court thick with suspicion and rigid etiquette. For many, such a fate would have been a death sentence for the spirit. For Sophie, it was the beginning of a transformation. From the moment she arrived in Russia, Sophie knew she would need to change to survive. She threw herself into learning Russian, mastering the language so thoroughly that she soon spoke it more fluently than Peter himself. A man born into the Russian court but never attached to its culture. She converted to the Orthodox faith, taking a new name, Catherine. It was not just an act of piety, but a strategy. If she was to be accepted, she had to become more Russian than the Russians themselves. Her marriage to Peter, however, brought no happiness. He ignored her, preferring his childish war games, his German companions, and his endless tankards of beer. Their bed was cold, her heart lonelier with each passing day, and within her, a thirst for power began to grow. Instead of surrendering to despair, Catherine charted a different course. She sought out Russia's nobility, mingled with influential officers, and befriended the intellectuals who debated the new gospel of reason spreading from Enlightenment Europe. She read Voltaire, devoured Montesquieu, and in the long, loveless nights, buried herself in books as if they were her only source of warmth. While Peter drowned in drink and play, Catherine quietly prepared to reinvent herself into something far greater, a queen, in every sense of the word. At court, she mastered the art of silence and observation. She knew when to smile, when to yield, and when to keep her true thoughts locked away. Beneath her gentle exterior, a will of iron was hardening. She understood that survival required more than being a dutiful wife. She had to become a power in her own right, and that power could only be forged through intellect, finesse, and patience. Even in her youth, Catherine grasped a truth that many monarchs never realized. A throne is not the birthright of the legitimate heir alone, but the prize of those clever and daring enough to seize it. And so, in the solitude of her marriage, she trained herself, quietly, relentlessly, preparing for the day when she would do the unthinkable, rise from an obscure princess of Zerbst to become Empress of all Russia. In history, there are fleeting moments that can alter the fate of an entire nation. For Catherine, that moment came in the summer of 1762, when she saw the chance not only to free herself from a loveless marriage, but to ascend directly to the throne of the largest empire in Europe. Peter III, her husband, had just become Tsar after the death of his aunt, Empress Elizabeth. But for Peter, the throne was like a military uniform, several sizes too large, something he wore awkwardly, never quite fitting into the role. His childish temperament, once merely irritating when he was Grand Duke, now became a real threat to the stability of the crown. He obsessed over toy soldiers, lost himself in the company of German officers, and paid little attention to the nation he was meant to rule. Worse still, he openly insulted the Russian Orthodox Church, the spiritual backbone of the empire. His decrees enraged the clergy. He flaunted favoritism toward Germans, while Russia was still haunted by its war with Prussia, and he alienated nearly every power that mattered. In just a few short months, Peter III achieved what few rulers manage. He turned almost every major force in the empire against him. The army saw him as weak, the church saw him as blasphemous, the nobility saw him as a fool. And in the void he created, Catherine, dismissed, neglected, underestimated, emerged as the obvious alternative. Catherine knew the danger of waiting. If she remained passive, she could be cast aside, imprisoned, or worse, like so many ill-fated empresses before her. So she chose to act. Her brilliance was not just in seizing the moment, but in building the networks that made it possible. She won over the Imperial Guard, the true power in St. Petersburg. The Orlov brothers, especially Grigory Orlov, both her lover and her ally, became the spearhead of her cause. It was not merely an affair, but a pact of survival. In June 1762, while Peter was away at Oranienbaum, Catherine and the guards made their move. That morning, she was brought to the guards' barracks in St. Petersburg. Dressed in a military uniform, she mounted a horse and was greeted with thunderous cheers as if she were already the rightful sovereign. The image was unforgettable. A small German princess, now standing tall in Russian uniform, hailed as the Mother of Russia. In that moment, long before her coronation, Catherine had already become Tsarina in the eyes of the soldiers. Peter, upon hearing the news, was almost paralyzed. He had no loyal army, no backing from the church, no resolve to fight. Under mounting pressure, he was forced to abdicate after barely 6 months on the throne. The man who dreamed of remaking Prussia within Russia lost everything in a matter of days. Soon after, Peter died under mysterious circumstances, clearing the path for Catherine to take her place in history. What made her triumph remarkable was not only its speed, but how she crafted herself into a legitimate symbol of power. She was not just a usurper, she became the savior of Russia. Where Peter was seen as foreign, Catherine reinvented herself as truly Russian. She spoke fluent Russian, had long converted to Orthodoxy, and seemed more devoted to the nation than the Tsar himself. It was the art of transformation, turning her foreign origins into a footnote and her role as a neglected wife into that of a mother of the nation. When Europe heard the news, the reaction was shock mixed with fascination. A woman, a minor German princess, had toppled a Tsar and claimed the Russian crown. To contemporaries, it defied every assumption about gender and power. Catherine was seen as a political phenomenon, a queen without a crown, for she had not inherited her throne by blood, but seized it with cunning and the loyalty of soldiers. And yet, it was precisely this illegitimacy that made her reign stronger. In a world where thrones so often fell to weak heirs, Catherine proved she sat upon hers not by accident of birth, but by sheer ability. Russians, accustomed to believing their czars were chosen by divine fate, now witnessed a woman who chose her own destiny. And strangely, they accepted her, perhaps even trusted her more than they ever trusted Peter III. Looking back, the coup of 1762 was more than a palace intrigue. It was the turning point of an empire. Catherine showed that power in Russia did not belong to those with papers of inheritance, but to those bold enough to seize it. In the moment she mounted that horse, in the roar of the guards, a truth was carved into history. The Russian throne now belonged to Catherine, and no one could take it from her. Her success carried its own paradox. Catherine became empress in the eyes of Europe, yet she was never entirely seen as a legitimate queen in the traditional sense. She was branded a usurper, the woman who stole the crown from her husband. And yet, in that scorn lay an undeniable respect. For Catherine had done what countless princes and kings had only dreamed of. She rewrote the destiny of an empire with her own hands. In September 1762, she was formally crowned Empress of Russia. It was the beginning of a reign that would last more than 3 decades, one of the most stable and brilliant eras in Russian history. But it was also the beginning of the rumors, the accusations, and the venomous tales that would follow her for the rest of her life. The question of her legitimacy lingered then, as it lingers even now. Was Catherine a rightful empress or a usurper? Perhaps the question misses the point. Power has never truly belonged to the rightful. It belongs to those bold enough to hold on to it. And Catherine, the small princess from Zerbst, the lonely wife spurned by her husband, proved that truth with the story of her life. Catherine seized the throne in a daring coup, but what made her the great was not that moment of audacity. Her true legacy was forged in the decades that followed, during more than 30 years of rule. In that time, Russia did not merely endure storms of change. It rose to become a true European power. And at the center of it all stood a woman who was at once authoritarian and refined, hungry for power, yet equally hungry to leave her mark as an enlightened reformer. From the very beginning, Catherine understood that a throne won by intrigue had to be secured by intellect. She needed to prove she was more than a usurper, that she was a queen capable of rewriting history. And so she launched reforms few would have imagined a foreign-born woman could achieve in the deeply conservative world of 18th century Russia. Education was among her earliest priorities. Catherine believed that a vast empire could only thrive if its people could read, write, and think. She was not aiming to turn peasants into philosophers, but she did want to cultivate a literate class capable of running an increasingly complex bureaucracy. In 1764, she founded the Smolny Institute for Noble Girls, an astonishing step in a society where women were still expected to remain confined to kitchens and churches. It symbolized her view of education not just as a tool of governance, but as a path toward modernization. Alongside education, Catherine turned to law. Russia's legal system was still medieval in spirit, patchwork and arbitrary, shaped more by custom and noble privilege than by fairness. Catherine sought to change this. She convened a commission to draft a new code of laws, drawing inspiration from Montesquieu and Beccaria. In her nakaz, or instruction, she called for an end to torture, stressed equality before the law, and imagined a more just system. In practice, most of these ideas remained theory. Russia's nobility had no intention of surrendering their privileges. But the ambition mattered. Catherine placed reform on the table and marked herself as one of the rare monarchs of her age to think ahead of her time. Her administrative reforms were equally bold. She divided the empire into provinces, aiming for more efficient governance. Russia stretched from Poland to Siberia, from the icy northern seas to the Caucasus. Such a vast realm could not be ruled effectively by decrees sent from St. Petersburg alone. By decentralizing power, Catherine hoped to transform a cumbersome empire into a smoother machine of rule, at least in theory. What is fascinating is that even as Catherine embraced the image of an Enlightenment monarch, she remained every inch a despot. She read Voltaire, exchanged letters with him for decades, and basked in his praise for her intellect and courage. She welcomed Diderot to Russia, spending hours in conversation with him on philosophy and art. To Europe, Catherine embodied the despot éclairé, the enlightened despot, someone who ruled with an iron hand, yet cloaked her power in the language of reason and learning. This paradox made her magnetic, admired by many, mistrusted by others. If her reforms built her domestic prestige, it was foreign policy and expansion that secured her place among history's great rulers. No one can deny that under Catherine, Russia's map changed dramatically. She expanded southward, annexing Crimea and seizing access to the Black Sea, something Russian rulers had dreamed of for centuries. With Crimea, Russia broke free from the icy grip of the north and stepped into warmer, resource-rich lands of immense strategic value. To the west, Catherine joined Austria and Prussia in carving up Poland in 3 successive partitions. The result was the dismemberment of a once great Central European power, with large swathes absorbed into the Russian Empire. Through these conquests, Catherine not only gained territory, but demonstrated to Europe that Russia was now a force impossible to ignore. Her triumphs were not merely military, but political. Catherine knew when to strike hard and when to compromise, when to ally with other powers and when to play them off each other. She was no reckless adventurer, but a careful strategist, plotting each move like a master chess player. By the time of her death, Russia was larger, wealthier, and more secure than it had ever been. Yet power and success always come with contradictions. Catherine wanted to be remembered as an enlightened monarch, a patron of the arts and learning, yet she crushed peasant uprisings with brutal force, most famously the Pugachev Rebellion. She spoke of equality before the law, yet entrenched the privileges of the nobility and tightened the chains of serfdom. She engaged Diderot in philosophical debate, but when he suggested sweeping reforms, she smiled and dismissed him, knowing that ruling was harsher than any ideal on paper. This was Catherine's essence, a woman who borrowed the light of enlightenment to illuminate her throne, but never let it burn away her grip on power. It was in this tension that she became both celebrated as a queen of reason and condemned as a political hypocrite. And yet, viewed through the longer lens of history, Catherine achieved her ultimate aim. She turned Russia into a genuine European power. Before her, Russia was often dismissed as a lumbering Eastern giant, heavy, backward, and alien to European civilization. After her, Russia was a central player at every political table. That is her undeniable legacy, despite all the criticisms. Catherine ruled not only as a queen, but as a shrewd politician, a strategist, a patron of culture, and a paradox incarnate. She was Voltaire's confidant and Pugachev's nemesis, a champion of liberty and a jailer of millions of serfs, a beacon of enlightenment and a shadow of tyranny. It was this very complexity that set her apart, making her one of the most extraordinary and controversial figures in European history. And perhaps that is exactly how she wished to be remembered, not simply as a Russian empress, but as truly great, powerful, contradictory, unforgettable. Throughout history, some rulers are remembered for their victories, some for their reforms, and others for their romances. Catherine belongs to all 3. She earned the title the Great for her political and military achievements, but just as enduring were the endless whispers, rumors, and scandalous tales about her love life. The long list of lovers became inseparable from her legend. Yet, if we see those relationships only as private indulgences, we miss something vital. Catherine turned intimacy into power, weaving love into the very fabric of her rule. From the very start of her reign, she understood she needed allies, strong men not only to ease her loneliness, but to secure the fragile throne she had just seized. Enter Grigory Orlov, a bold young officer, one of the masterminds behind the coup that toppled Peter III. Orlov was more than a lover. He was a pillar of military and political strength during Catherine's first uncertain years on the throne. With the backing of the Orlov brothers, especially Grigory, Catherine stabilized her shaky crown and crushed her enemies' hopes before they could take root. In return, Orlov received wealth, power, and of course, a place in the Empress's heart. But Catherine was never a woman ruled entirely by passion. She knew when a relationship had served its political purpose. When Orlov began to fade, his brilliance dulled, his ambitions swelling beyond his reach, Catherine quietly set him aside. Not with cold cruelty, but with generosity. lands, titles, honors, ensuring he kept his dignity while she moved on. Here we see Catherine not as a woman carried away by desire, but as a strategist, using romance as a piece on the chessboard of empire. Among all her companions, one name shines above the rest: Grigory Potemkin. Once an unremarkable officer, he rose swiftly to become the central figure in her court and, more importantly, in her heart. Their bond was unlike any other. Potemkin was not just a lover, he was her shadow co-emperor, sharing with her the burdens of governance and the dreams of expansion. Rumors swirled that they secretly married, though no evidence survives. It hardly matters. What mattered was their partnership, one that transcended love or desire to become a political union. Potemkin orchestrated the annexation of Crimea, helping transform Catherine's southern empire from dream to reality. Even the legend of the Potemkin villages, those theatrical facades supposedly erected to impress her, testifies to the myth and mockery surrounding his influence. And yet, their story reveals something deeper. Catherine never allowed affection to eclipse authority. They could love, trust, and share, but Potemkin never became a second czar. They walked together, but never as equals in power. Potemkin may have been her shadow emperor, but the light always fell on Catherine alone. She mastered that delicate balance between intimacy and rule, between partnership and dominion. Nor did she ever allow her love life to tie her down permanently. After Potemkin, she continued to take lovers, usually younger men, handsome, and above all, unfailingly loyal. And when their time was up, they left not in disgrace, but with titles, estates, and generous pensions, ensuring a comfortable life. Catherine never discarded them like broken toys, for she knew that those closest to the throne could also become its greatest threats. Instead, she bought loyalty with generosity, transforming fleeting affairs into lasting safeguards. To Europe, Catherine's use of passion as a tool of power was both fascinating and terrifying. In a world dominated almost entirely by men, a woman who openly took lovers and who transformed them into political allies was intolerable. Whispers of excess swirled, salacious tales were invented to demean her, recasting an enlightened monarch as little more than a slave to lust. The cruelest myth of all, that she died in some obscene accident involving a horse, was nothing more than misogyny, born from Europe's fear of a woman who loved, lived, and ruled on her own terms. Strip away the gossip, and what remains is a clear political logic. Orlov gave her the throne, Potemkin gave her Crimea. The young lovers gave her loyalty and the vitality to project power. For Catherine, love and power were inseparable, woven together into both weapon and shield. This, perhaps, is the paradox that makes her so elusive. She was both passionate and calculating, a woman who could love deeply and yet remain the master strategist. No lover could ever claim to possess Catherine, for she belonged only to the throne. Yet no one can deny that she did love, that she lived fully, and that she turned love itself into part of her legacy. Looking back, her romances did not weaken her. They strengthened her reign. She proved that power is not only forged by armies, laws, or treaties, but also through seduction, loyalty, and the art of human bonds. In her hands, this soft power was as sharp and effective as any Russian sword. And perhaps, after all the rumors and laughter fade, one truth endures. Catherine turned love into politics, desire into strength, and private life into history. In that, she stood apart from every ruler before her. She ruled not only with a crown upon her head, but with her heart, her wit, and a mastery of relationships that were never truly private, but politics of the highest order. If there's one thing Catherine the Great has never been able to escape in the collective memory, it isn't just her victories, her reforms, or the letters she exchanged with Voltaire. It's a rumor so obscene that any serious historian can only sigh at its persistence. People claimed Catherine died in a grotesque accident while attempting to have intercourse with a horse. A filthy, haunting, and of course entirely fabricated tale. Yet it has clung to her name with such tenacity that even today, if you ask an ordinary person about Catherine the Great, chances are their first thought won't be Crimea or the partition of Poland, but the horse. The origin of this rumor lay in the West's obsession with Catherine's private life. When she died in 1796, her enemies across Europe, anxious about a woman who had transformed Russia into a great power, leapt at the chance to drag her down. And what easier way to discredit a powerful woman than to recast her as a symbol of uncontrollable lust, crossing the line of humanity itself? Death by horse, a story that was at once grotesque and erotic, became the perfect weapon. In truth, Catherine died far more ordinarily. She suffered a stroke in her bathroom and passed away quietly a few hours later in bed at the age of 67, a subdued end compared to a turbulent life. But for those intent on staining her legacy, that reality lacked drama. So they invented another script, that she had a special contraption built to hoist a horse into her chamber, and that the animal crushed her to death. A monstrous vision spun from dark imagination, whispered across Europe as a tantalizing royal secret no one could resist repeating. What is striking is that this wasn't an isolated slander, but part of a larger pattern in how the West talked about Catherine throughout her reign. The moment she openly took lovers, sometimes replacing them as the years passed, European society responded with contempt. Male monarchs with dozens of mistresses were praised as virile and powerful. But when Catherine did the same, it was cast as decadence, as addiction to desire. A French king might be celebrated for the hive of bees buzzing in his palace, but a Russian empress became a nymphomaniac. That was the lens through which female authority was always filtered, sexuality as a weapon to diminish them. Contemporary writers in Britain and France delighted in publishing scurrilous books about her, portraying her as greedy not only for power but also for pleasure. She was branded the Messalina of the North, likened to the Roman empress infamous for debauchery. Every affair of hers, even those with clear political significance, was reduced to a sordid joke. And so, a reign of more than 3 decades was squeezed into a single damning word: licentious. The bitter irony was that Catherine herself understood this all too well. In her letters, she often complained that Europe would never see her as a sovereign like any other, but always through the prism of her sex. She could draft a legal code, found schools, expand an empire, hold hours-long conversations with Voltaire. But the moment she took a new lover, all of that was eclipsed by crude fascination. The horse rumor, then, was not just a cruel jest. It was a reflection of something deeper, that female power was consistently refracted through the lens of sexuality. A man could rule with iron and be hailed as great. A woman who did the same had to prove she was not too soft, not too emotional, and not too carnal. Catherine's very existence unsettled a male-dominated world, and to punish her, they reached for their oldest weapon, turning desire into sin and rumor into history. And Catherine was hardly alone. History brims with powerful women trapped inside lurid fables. Cleopatra was reduced to a seductress rather than remembered as a strategist. Anne Boleyn was branded incestuous to justify her execution. And Catherine the Great, with all her accomplishments, was forever chained to an imaginary horse. Yet from another angle, the persistence of these tales testifies to her power. No one wastes time concocting obscene myths about someone irrelevant. Myths are born of fear, and what was threatened here was the traditional order, the belief that only men could rule. The horse story, then, was both insult and backhanded acknowledgement. It revealed that Catherine had slipped beyond the categories her enemies could tolerate. They could not explain her success within the normal script, so they resorted to ridicule. She became too immense to ignore, but too dangerous to celebrate. So they defamed her, ensuring that posterity would remember not the reformer queen, but the scandal. And indeed, the scandal has endured for more than 2 centuries. It seeped into pamphlets, gossip, cartoons. Even today, in the age of the internet, Catherine is still shadowed by the horse. We know the truth, but we remain drawn to the lie, because the lie is easier to tell, more shocking, more seductive. Look deeper, though, and another truth emerges. The horse story is not about Catherine at all. It is about how society has treated powerful women. It shows that for centuries, a woman could rule an empire and still be judged by her bed. Until we recognize that, the rumor will continue to echo, not just as an insult to Catherine, but as a mirror reflecting civilization's own obsessions. Catherine the Great was therefore both victim and emblem. Victim of vicious rumor, yet emblem of the fear a woman could inspire in a man's world. And perhaps, if she could smirk from the beyond, it would not be with sorrow, but with irony. Because no matter how many obscene lies were told, no matter how many crude stories spread, she remained great. while those who forged the rumors are nothing now but forgotten names, lost in the shadows of history.